More coaching search talk and big results from the Louisville women's basketball team. There's a ton of stuff to talk about on this bonus episode of the Locked On Louisville podcast. Let's get right on into it.
You are Locked On Louisville, your daily podcast on the Louisville Cardinals. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, what's going on, everyone? Welcome into this bonus episode of the Locked On Louisville podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by Rock Auto. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. Visit rockauto.com and tell them Locked On sent you. As always, I'm your host, Dalton Pence. I serve as a credential media member for Cardinal Sports Zone, and I also do some PA announcing work for the university in various sports. I want to take this time to personally thank you for making us your first listen of the day. And just a reminder, the Locked On Louisville podcast, free on all streaming services, including YouTube, 5 days a week, your team every day. On this bonus episode, a lot of stuff to talk about. We'll jump back into coaching search talk, talking about two more candidates and the feasibility of both of those possibly becoming the next Louisville head coach. That is Murray State's Matt McMahon, Loyola Chicago's Drew Valentine. We'll also transition into the women's basketball realm where the Cards totally dominated the Notre Dame Fighting Irish. We'll talk about that contest. We'll also discuss what needs to happen for the women's basketball team to secure a number one seed in the NCAA tournament coming up here basically just under a month. So let's start out getting right into the coaching search. Obviously, I feel like I have to keep mentioning this. Just because I talk about a certain candidate or candidates on this show does not necessarily mean that they are seriously being considered by the university. In fact, there hasn't necessarily been a lot of leaks, so to speak, or information on guys being seriously considered outside of Kenny Payne. So we'll just continue to go down the line, talk about each candidate, whether or not they would be a good fit here. On today's episode, obviously, Murray State's Matt McMahon, Loyola Chicago's Drew Valentine. I think that both are very solid coaches. They're up-and-comers, especially the latter. Guys that are having a ton of success of where they're at in the mid-major realm. But ultimately, I'm not necessarily sure that they are the right fit for Louisville. We'll explain why here. Starting with the first candidate, that's Matt McMahon from Murray State. Obviously, he's a guy that when you think of Murray State, you think of John Morant. He coached Morant, for his 2 seasons in the with the Racers. Overall, for his career since he took over the Murray State program in 2015-16. He has a 147-66 record that's just under 70%. So he's been a guy that has, gotten the most out of his teams. He has only had one losing record that came in 2016 and 17. John Morant came to town and they went to the tournament twice. 2019-2020, they were the regular season champion. Obviously, the conference tournament and the NCAA tournament that followed were canceled by COVID. Last year, they were 13-13. This season, 24-2. Have been in the AP poll, so it looks like the Racers are right back into the thick of things. The issue that I have here, and I don't like to use the phrase checking off boxes because I think that I don't know. I think it's somewhat disrespectful to some coaches and stuff like that. But ultimately, I think that that's kind of the closest to what I'm thinking in terms of the Louisville job, because I think that there's certain things, certain qualities, certain qualifications that are being looked at for this position. It's a high-profile position. The university has to make sure that they get this hire right. I think that Matt McMahon would be probably an uninspiring hire for the university, for at least for the fan base. That's not necessarily indicative of him not necessarily having a ton of success in Murray State, which he's been to the NCAA tournament twice. Might have been 3 years if COVID wouldn't have canceled 2020. But I feel like this hire maybe doesn't necessarily need to be high profile in the fact you get a top college coach, but it has to be a guy that checks off some of these boxes. Recruiting wise, it's definite. It's for sure. Proven that he's got an eye for talent, going out and getting a guy like John Morant, who is now an NBA All-Star starter. It's right there. So, you see the development, you see, the eye for talent. So finding diamonds in the rough is a key thing that McMahon brings to the table. Tevin Brown, I think his name was Cowan, the big guy on that team. They brought in a lot of talent to Murray State, and they've been able to be coached up. There's a ton of development going on. Matt McMahon is a very good players coach. Guys love playing for him. He's a guy very solid X's and O's. When you watch the team play, they're very solid 3-point shooting. They move the ball around a ton, and they get the ball in their best players' hands and let them operate. I think that's key, and he's able to be he's able to adapt depending on the certain skill set of a certain team, the certain trend of a certain team, etc. So, but ultimately, recruiting wise is the key thing, and that's kind of what it was with Chris Mack as well. Is how is a certain guy going to adapt to recruiting on a whole different in a whole different atmosphere, so to speak? The Power 5 recruiting is a lot different than mid-major. How well are you going to be able to go up against the big boys of college basketball as well? Matt McMahon, coming from a mid-major, it's hard to discredit tournament success, lack of tournament success, because a lot of it depends on it depends on winning the conference tournament pretty much. But even then, it's just all a matter of getting to where you need to be in that realm. So I actually I think Murray State actually lost in the conference tournament in 2000. They lose in 2020, maybe. I forget, but they didn't make the tournament, put it that way. But you can't necessarily discredit, not going far in the tournament, just considering the fact that you are at a mid-major. You're kind of, coaching with your hands behind your back, because you have to recruit to, a mid-major program. I just think that Matt McMahon, good coach. I would like to see him make a Power 5 move to a different program, and if he were to excel there, then maybe down the road Louisville takes a look at him. But right now, decent, pretty solid coach. Decent fit, just maybe not necessarily the right timing. There's a couple factors that, lack of recruiting, track record and stuff like that. I just don't necessarily think it would be the most inspiring hire. The other one is Loyola's. I will say, just a second before we get to Drew Valentine, Matt McMahon does have a $500,000 annual value contract. The buyout is $500,000. So obviously, if Louisville wanted to make it happen, they definitely could make it happen. On the other hand, I don't necessarily know the terms of Loyola Chicago's coach Drew Valentine's his contract terms or buyout or anything like that. I do know that he is the youngest coach in power in Division I. I think right now he is 30 years old, taking over for Porter Moser, who has led that Ramblers program to many tournament appearances, a couple of deep runs. Right now, the Ramblers are 19-5. They made it to the NCAA, or they made it to the AP poll. The issue with Valentine, and this is probably shouldn't come as a surprise, is I think that there's a ton of risk involved with Valentine. I think he's going to be a guy that's going to eventually get a big job. Maybe not necessarily on the Louisville, maybe not necessarily on the on the same level as Louisville, but I do think he could get to Power 5 job, kind of like how Porter Moser did with Oklahoma. You could see him going to kind of a bottom tier Power 5 school. But I think that Drew Valentine, he's a guy that a younger guy. There's a lot of appeal going with the younger guy, because he's doing well with Loyola. The question remains is would he be able to recruit? He's doing this with some of Porter Moser's players and stuff like that. So the question remains, there's just a lot of, question marks out there. Number one, how good of a recruiter is he? Number two, can he do this with his own players? And number three, I wonder if obviously his name was kind of brought up in the initial conversation of, okay, if they wanted to think outside the box, they could look at a guy like Valentine. But ultimately, I'm not necessarily sure how good of a fit this is. I think that it might be a decent fit, but just completely wrong timing. I think that he's got to either establish a run of success with the Ramblers, or he has to go to another a higher school in lower Power 5 and succeed, kind of like how Steve Forbes is, to get a look at the Louisville position. But ultimately, right now, I think both Matt McMahon and Drew Valentine are good coaches, but it's just not necessarily a good timing for either of them. They have to show that they can continue the success throughout their careers before I think they become Louisville level coaches. So, transitioning over into the women's basketball side of things, the Cardinals defeated the Notre Dame Fighting Irish 73-47 on Super Bowl Sunday. I want to talk about that result. We'll do that here in just a second after we talk about our friends at BetOnline. Look, football might be over for the season, but basketball is in full steam for both pro and college hoops. From all the latest odds, totals, player performances, props, to where the next fired head coach is going to land, BetOnline is the number one spot for all of your sports sporting needs. It remains the best spot for all of your sports scores, podcasts, and news this season. But look, it's not just basketball. BetOnline.net is your source for hockey, boxing, and UFC odds, right to the Olympic coverage and information. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends in action. BetOnline is where the game starts. All right, the Cardinals 73-47 victory over the Notre Dame Fighting Irish. They were number 18 when the Cardinals defeated them. Currently speaking, the Irish have fallen just one spot to 19th. They beat the NC State Wolfpack a couple weeks ago. This was a very solid performance for the Cardinals. They started out kind of slow, went up 14-13, but the second quarter set the tone, 18-8 in terms of deficit, and then it was all Louisville after that. 73-47, just a huge victory for the team. So looking at what some of the Cards did, there were 3 players that scored in double figures. Haley Van Lith continues her impressive streak. She was 50% from the field, 16 points, 2 steals, 2 assists. Kiana Smith led the way, 17 points. She was 6 for 13 from the field. Chelsea Hall also scored in double figures, had 13 points, 3 assists, 5 rebounds. Olivia Cochran led. She had 6 points, 8 rebounds. Emily Inksler 12 points, 9 rebounds, 5 steals, 2 blocks overall. And then you saw some other players, look solid as well. From the Notre Dame side of things, Sam Burnell didn't necessarily play all that much, only 3 minutes. She had 4 points. The Notre Dame bench only accumulated 5 points. Maddie Westbeld had 10. Citron had 13. Miles had 11. Dodson with 8. Mabry didn't score a single point. She was 0 for 8 from the field. It was just a classic performance put on by the women's basketball team of just overall very, very solid defense, right? So from one point, especially in the first half, Notre Dame, I think, was 1 of 14 from 3. They finished 2 of 22. So a team that usually shoots the ball pretty well, Louisville made it very challenging for the Fighting Irish on that end of the offensive spectrum. 2 of 12, while Louisville was 6 of 17. Notre Dame turned the ball over 16 times. Didn't shoot the ball well at all either. They only shot at 31.7%. So from pretty much the get-go, when it comes to like the second quarter and stuff like that, it was just all Louisville pretty much all the time after that. And that's something that really kind of, I'm not going to say convinces me, because I've been convinced all season long, but it just kind of like reassures me that, hey, look, this team is legit. I think this is definitely one of the top 4 teams in the country as we speak right now. I mean, they are defeating teams. I mean, they have only lost 1 game in ACC play. That comes to NC State, and they led for 30 minutes of that one. They were up by double digits going in the fourth quarter before that historic disaster of a debacle. But ultimately, this is just a prime example of how Louisville's defense can take hold of a game. 47 points for the Notre Dame Fighting Irish, who average well more than that. They're a team that has been playing very well. In fact, Notre Dame, ranked, they have 6 losses. They're 10-4 in conference play. They're going to be making the tournament, and they could be a team that could make a decent little run. This is just a huge result for Louisville, nonetheless, because it at the very least, it bolsters the tournament resume. Now, we're going to talk about what Louisville needs to do here in just a couple minutes to ensure that they get a number 1 seed, come tournament time. But ultimately, it's going to come down to, getting a win like this. It's very convincing, like Michigan. They had a very convincing win over Michigan earlier in the year. I mean, they've put together a very, very solid resume. They beat Kentucky, which that doesn't necessarily look like a good win now, but they beat UConn despite not having Beckers Azzy Fudd. Michigan, they beaten Georgia Tech, they beaten Duke, they beaten a handful of ranked teams, but I think that Notre Dame, in terms of the ACC, just landscape stuff like that. I think they're the third or fourth best team outside of, Georgia Tech. I think Boston College is probably up there as well. But Louisville winning this game, I just think bodes well for the rest of the season. It keeps the confidence high. Just another showing from a great defensive side of things, and offensively, although they didn't score 90, 100 points like they had in recent matchups, they did force a team to forfeit. But I don't necessarily know what happened in terms of the Virginia forfeit decision and stuff like that. They blamed it on travel issues, despite it being 61 and sunny in Charlottesville that day. I'm not necessarily sure what happened, so I don't really want to truly speculate, but all I know is that it was a forfeit. Doesn't count toward the overall record, but it does count to the ACC record. So overall, I mean, the Notre Dame game, the team hadn't played in a week, so they stayed fresh. They came out and didn't play with their food, so to speak. They handled a ranked team. They took care of business. I think that Louisville has been a team that sometimes has played down to their competition sometimes this season, but overall they're looking very, very solid on both ends of the court. I love what I'm seeing offensively from them. It's good to see Kiana Smith get back into the groove of things. It's good to see the consistency from Haley Van Lith and what we're continually seeing from the sophomore star. And it's very awesome to see Chelsea Hall scoring in double figures, because when she's scoring in double figures, the offensive ceiling raises a little bit, because she's probably not even a top 3 to 4 option on this team in terms of scoring and stuff like that. So when you see her scoring in double figures, having a ton of players in the backcourt that can shoot the ball well and stuff like that. They shot the ball decent from 3. I mean, it was like 40% or something like that. Shot the ball well from the field. So overall, a good win. I don't want to hype it up too much, because I think that it's obviously a matchup that the Cardinals should have won. I think that really what I'm kind of getting at is the fact that they won this game by nearly 30 points, which is incredible against a ranked team that had just beaten NC State, within the calendar month. Or not within the past 30 days. So solid win. We're going to talk now about what the Cardinals need to do to make sure that they get a number 1 seed in the NCAA tournament. That obviously, you could take that a couple different ways. I think that it's really going to show just how tough it is, because there's a lot of teams that could possibly be into the mix. We'll talk about that here in just a second after we talk about our friends and the title sponsor of the show, Rock Auto. With the ever-increasing numbers of makes and models, it's not impossible for your local chain auto parts store to stock all the parts you need. Why endure often pointless or seemingly intimidating questioning and wait while the person behind the counter orders the parts on their computer, choosing the only brand their warehouse happens to carry, when you have computers with access to rockauto.com at home and in your pocket? It allows you to save time and money. It's a family business serving do-it-yourselfers for over 20 years. The prices are reliably low for every customer, and they have everything you could ever need, from brake parts, tail lamps, motor oil, and even new carpet. So do yourself a favor. Go to rockauto.com right now and see all the parts available for your car or truck. Right locked on in their How Did You Hear About Us box, so they know we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com. Going into the last segment of the show, I want to discuss what the Cardinals need to do to ensure that they get a number 1 seed in the upcoming NCAA tournament. Currently, they are 3rd in the country. They sit right behind South Carolina, who has 1 loss on the season. Stanford is 21-3. NC State is right behind them at 23-3. You also have Indiana, Iowa State, and then looking a little further back, Baylor, Arizona, and Michigan and UConn. So ultimately, I think right now the 1 seed, obviously there's a lot of you're still season left, so teams could lose. But South Carolina, Stanford, Louisville, NC State, Indiana, Iowa State, all kind of in contention. I think the others are on the outside looking in. If the season were to end today, Louisville would be getting a number 1 seed. I just exited out that's great. Just exited out the tab that I have going up. That's absolutely fantastic. But in terms of the remainder of the schedule, my gosh, I'm not having a good day. I'm looking at the rest of the schedule. The Cards have 4 games left. 3 are against ranked opponents, so it's not smooth sailing. Number one, the Cards are going to have to, to ensure a number one seed. Now put it this way: I'm not saying that they have to absolutely run the table, but when you consider what is, what's on the table, if South Carolina is a team that, unless they go on a losing streak, they're going to get a one seed. Stanford is a team that you would predict to get a one seed. NC State as well. They have a favorable remainder of the regular season. They're going to likely be the number one seed in the conference tournament. So NC State's going to be there. So three of them are not necessarily set in stone, but Louisville is looking for that other one seed. Indiana, Iowa State, etc., are kind of in contention for that. So I think that to ensure that you get a one seed, North Carolina has struggled. Virginia Tech's a team that they could beat. They just beat Notre Dame by 30. They beat Pittsburgh by a ton this season. I think winning out the rest of the regular season to where you end the season 26-2. That's kind of what you're looking for the women's basketball team. And then when you get to the conference tournament, I'm not saying that you have to get the number one overall seed in the tournament, or the conference tournament, I should say, because, look, I mean, they're tied with NC State in terms of record. NC State holds the tiebreaker in terms of the head-to-head win in Raleigh. So, getting the number one seed in the conference doesn't matter because you still have to handle business. I think to ensure that the team gets a number one seed, they have to at least make the conference championship game. If they run the table to end the regular season and they go to the conference championship game and they still lose to NC State, I think that a Louisville team with 3 losses, 2 of them being to NC State, 1 of them being to Arizona the first game of the year, I think that's enough for this team to get a 1 seed in the NCAA tournament. Now, let's say that the team does lose one of their last regular season games. Let's say they lose to Virginia Tech or at Notre Dame. To ensure that they get a 1 seed, they're going to have to win the conference championship. Now, would it be unheard of if they were to lose a game and then lose in the conference championship to NC State? And get a 1 seed. I don't think that it's off the table. I think they could definitely get a 1 seed. I think it's kind of the same probability of the team running the regular season and then losing in the conference semifinals to Georgia Tech or a Boston College or something like that. So the best route that they could go is, just kind of, if they win out, they're obviously going to be a 1 seed. Put it that way. If they win the next 4 of the regular season, if they win the conference championship, there's no way they're not a 1 seed. If they're not, it's criminal. But to ensure that they need to be, in terms of the cushion, in terms of the breathing room that they have, it really needs to be a situation where, they're only losing 1 game between now and Selection Monday. So I think that this team has put themselves in a great position. Their tournament resume, if it comes down to where, they do lose 2 games between now and Selection Monday, their tournament resume does help. I mean, they have a win over Notre Dame. They possibly could have 2 over Notre Dame. They could have 1 over North Carolina, Virginia Tech. They have 1 over Duke. They have victories over Arizona, Michigan, UConn, Georgia Tech, Boston College, etc. So handling business and not having really any bad losses is a very, very key thing for Louisville when it comes to resume. But like I said, I keep coming back to at least making the conference tournament, I think, or at least conference tournament final. Can't speak again today. But overall, this is a team that even if they get a 2 seed, I think that they're going to make a deep run. But the difference, the kind of drop off between, a number 1 to where you wouldn't have to play Stanford, NC State, or South Carolina until the Final Four, and then possibly squaring off with like an Indiana or if you're Indiana, Baylor, Iowa State. I think you set yourself up. I don't think that there's a 2 seed like Stanford was, in this season's tournament. Maybe UConn. But ultimately, right now, there's no team outside of UConn that even resembles that. So overall, we talked about some more basketball coaching options with Murray State's Matt McMahon, Loyola Chicago's Drew Valentine, and why. Yes, they're good X's and O's coaches. They're player coaches. They're up and comers. There's just not necessarily enough sample size and enough recruiting trail experience and stuff like that to where I don't think that Louisville really truly considers them. They're very much on the outside looking in. We also talked about the Louisville women's basketball huge victory against Notre Dame on Super Bowl Sunday. Also discussed what needs to happen for the women's basketball team to make sure that they are a number 1 seed come tournament time. Tomorrow, Jeremy Wallman back on the show. We'll talk a little bit about Nick Cardwell getting named the tight ends coach. We'll have a little mailbag segment, and we'll talk a little bit more about some stuff. Before we get out of here, a couple quick shout-outs. First, the Cardinal Sports Zone podcast. Most recent was dropped on Sunday. You can get that on the Odyssey app or wherever you like to get your podcast. The other podcast I want to talk about is the Locked On Bets podcast hosted by your boy Q with handicapping and expert analysis from Lee Sterling. You can get that on the Odyssey app or wherever you like to get your podcast. That's going to wrap up this bonus episode of the Locked On Louisville podcast. Everyone have a great day, and we'll see you right back here tomorrow. Go.